The bright lights of the CNN studio reflected off Kellyanne Conway's determined face as she sat across from Representative Jasmine Crockett, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. The debate on election integrity had just started, but Conway wasn't waiting to land her first punch. "Representative Crockett has been spreading misinformation for months," Conway declared, her voice sharp as she leaned forward in her chair. "She claims to have evidence of voter suppression, but it's all fabricated talking points designed to undermine our electoral system." The camera caught Crockett's reaction, a brief smile that didn't reach her eyes, her fingers tapping methodically on a folder in front of her. Conway continued her attack, unaware of what that folder contained. "Everything the Congresswoman has said about these voting laws is a complete lie," Conway pressed on, her voice rising with confidence. "She has zero evidence to back up these outrageous claims." What Conway didn't realize was that Crockett had spent the last 6 months quietly gathering documents, data, and testimonials, and in the next few minutes, she was about to reveal evidence that would not only silence Conway, but potentially end her credibility as a political commentator forever. Before diving into today's explosive confrontation, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more political showdowns that change the game. Now, let's watch as this heated exchange turns into one of the most shocking moments in recent political media. Kellyanne Conway sat confidently in her chair, the embodiment of political survivorship. At 57, she had weathered countless storms throughout her career, from campaign controversies to White House drama. The former counselor to President Trump had built her reputation on an uncanny ability to deflect, pivot, and reframe narratives, skills that had earned her both admirers and critics across the political landscape. With her blonde hair perfectly styled and wearing a sharp red blazer, Conway exuded the confidence of someone who had stood at the highest levels of power. She had recently joined CNN as a political analyst, after a brief hiatus from the spotlight, promising to bring truth and balance back to political discussions. Today's debate on voting rights legislation was meant to be her moment to reassert her influence. Across from her sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, the 43-year-old Congresswoman from Texas, who had risen rapidly through political ranks. Before entering Congress, Crockett had worked as a civil rights attorney, representing clients in voting rights cases across the South. Her law background gave her a methodical approach to politics that contrasted sharply with Conway's more combative style. Crockett wore a deep blue suit, her natural hair styled elegantly, a subtle American flag pin on her lapel. Unlike Conway, whose voice often rose when making points, Crockett spoke with a measured calm that disguised the intensity behind her words. She had been relatively quiet until now, allowing Conway to dominate the opening minutes. The stakes couldn't be higher. This wasn't just another cable news debate, it was happening just weeks before crucial midterm elections, where voting rights had become the central issue. Conway was representing conservative arguments that new voting laws were about election integrity, while Crockett was there to argue these same laws constituted targeted voter suppression. Behind the scenes, tensions had been building for months. Conway had repeatedly accused Democrats like Crockett of fabricating voter suppression narratives for political gain, calling them conspiracy theorists on multiple Fox News appearances. Crockett, meanwhile, had been assembling evidence about the real-world impacts of new voting legislation, working with legal teams across multiple states. The CNN moderator, sensing the tension, tried to establish ground rules. "Let's keep this civil and fact-based," he urged, though neither woman seemed particularly interested in his plea for decorum. The audience, both in studio and at home, could feel that this wasn't going to be an ordinary political discussion. The energy in the room suggested something more consequential was about to unfold. "Congresswoman Crockett," the moderator began, "you've claimed these new voting laws have a disproportionate impact on minority communities. Can you elaborate?" But before Crockett could answer, Conway jumped in. "If I may," she said, not actually waiting for permission. "The Congresswoman has been making these claims for months without providing any actual evidence. It's irresponsible fear-mongering, plain and simple." Crockett didn't immediately respond to the interruption. Instead, she calmly opened the folder in front of her, the one Conway had been eyeing suspiciously since the camera started rolling. The stage was set for what would become one of the most consequential political confrontations of the year. "Ms. Conway, I've been listening to you make the same claims on various networks for months now," Crockett finally responded, her voice steady but with an edge of steel beneath the calm. "You've called me a liar on Fox News, Newsmax, and just about anywhere else that would have you. Today I'd like to address those accusations directly." Conway smiled, the practiced media smile that had served her through countless contentious interviews. "By all means, Congresswoman, but the American people deserve facts, not more democratic talking points." Crockett nodded slowly. "Facts. Exactly what I was thinking." She pulled out the first document from her folder. "Let's start with your claim that there is zero evidence of disparate impact from the new Georgia voting law." The moderator tried to interject, but both women ignored him. "This is data from Fulton County," Crockett continued, sliding a paper across the table. "After the new law reduced drop boxes from 38 to just 8, wait times in predominantly black neighborhoods increased by 310%, while wait times in predominantly white neighborhoods increased by only 18%. The camera caught Conway's momentary hesitation before she recovered. "Cherry-picked statistics don't tell the full story. Those drop boxes were removed for security concerns. Security concerns that you yourself called imaginary when you were working for the previous administration," Crockett cut in. "I have the transcript of that press briefing right here." She pulled out another document. Conway's eyes narrowed. "One comment taken out of context doesn't—" "It's not one comment," Crockett said, her voice still measured but growing more intense. She pulled out a thicker stack of papers. "This is a compilation of 27 statements from you and your former colleagues explicitly stating that drop boxes and mail-in voting were secure, until, of course, it became politically convenient to claim otherwise." The studio grew tense as Conway shifted in her seat. "The context changed after the 2020 election." "Did it?" Crockett interrupted. "Or did the narrative change when the results weren't what your team wanted?" She turned to the moderator. "Can we show the first exhibit on screen?" The screen behind them displayed an internal memo that had been leaked from a conservative strategy group, dated 2 weeks after the 2020 election. Highlighted was a paragraph that read, "Messaging priority. Focus on voting irregularities regardless of evidence. The perception of fraud is as powerful as fraud itself for eroding confidence." Conway's face flushed. "Where did you get that?" "That's not a document I've ever seen or endorsed." "And yet," Crockett continued, pulling out another paper, "here's an email where you forwarded this exact memo to 6 members of your team with the note, 'Good strategy here, let's implement.'" The moderator, now fully aware he had lost control of the segment, tried again. "Perhaps we should—" "No, I want to address this," Conway insisted, her voice rising. "This is exactly the kind of political hit job that—" "That what? Crockett challenge that exposes contradictions?" "I'm not finished." She pulled out what appeared to be a map. "This shows polling place closures in Texas over the past 2 years. Notice anything interesting about where they're concentrated?" The map clearly showed closures clustered in urban areas and communities with higher minority populations. Conway shook her head. "Polling place decisions are made by local election officials based on resources and turnout." "Exactly," Crockett said. "And I have here testimonials from 3 of those officials who say they were pressured to close these specific locations by state-level operatives who cited resource allocation, while privately admitting it was about demographic management." She pulled out another document, "including this email from your former colleague specifically recommending closures in these 5 districts because, and I quote, demographics aren't favorable to our candidates." The tension in the studio was becoming unbearable. Conway's usual composure was cracking as she reached for her water glass with a slightly trembling hand. "These are selective leaks taken completely out of context," Conway insisted, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "Context is exactly what I'm providing," Crockett replied, her confidence growing visibly as Conway's diminished. Conway's great confidence and pep back on responsibility, it diminished. "Let's talk about your repeated claim that voter ID laws don't suppress minority votes." Conway seemed to regain some footing on this familiar territory. "They absolutely don't. It's insulting to suggest minorities can't obtain ID." "I agree it would be insulting to suggest that," Crockett nodded. "What's actually happening is more complicated." She produced a series of charts. After Texas implemented its strict voter ID law, provisional ballot usage increased 300%, in minority-heavy districts. And of those voters, 78% had ID but were turned away because of name mismatches as small as a hyphen or initial difference. The moderator, making one last attempt to regain control, said, "We need to take a commercial break." "Before we do," Crockett said firmly, pulling out what appeared to be a thumb drive, "I want to address Ms. Conway's most serious accusation against me, that I've been lying about having evidence of coordinated voter suppression." Conway's expression shifted, a mix of irritation and growing concern evident on her face. This drive contains audio recordings from 3 closed-door meetings, where voter suppression strategies were explicitly discussed, Crockett said, her voice now carrying an edge that had the entire studio transfixed. "Including one where you were present, Ms. Conway." The color drained from Conway's face just as the producer signaled for a commercial break, the timing creating a cliffhanger that would have viewers nationwide frantically waiting for the segment to return. When the cameras started rolling again after the commercial break, the atmosphere in the studio had completely transformed. Conway sat stiffly in her chair, her usual animated gestures replaced by a rigid posture. Crockett remained composed, the thumb drive now sitting prominently on the table between them. The moderator, clearly aware that history was potentially unfolding on his show, spoke carefully. "Congresswoman Crockett, before the break you mentioned audio recordings from closed-door meetings. Can you elaborate on what these contain?" Crockett nodded. "Absolutely." She turned to Conway. "Mr. Conway, on March 12th of last year, you attended a strategy session at the Heritage Foundation where voter access was discussed. Do you recall that meeting?" Conway's media training kicked in. "I attend dozens of policy discussions every month. I can't be expected to remember every—" "Let me refresh your memory," Crockett interrupted, nodding to the production team. "With permission from CNN Legal, we've vetted and can play a brief excerpt." The audio began playing through the studio speakers. Conway's distinctive voice was unmistakable. "Look, the math is simple. If everyone voted, we'd lose. We need to be strategic about who gets to the polls. These new laws give us the cover of election integrity while accomplishing exactly what we need." Another male voice responded, "But won't this look like targeted suppression?" Conway's recorded voice replied, "Only if someone can prove intent. That's why we never put the real strategy in writing. It's always election security, never demographic adjustment." The studio fell silent as the audio ended. Conway's face had turned pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "That recording is edited and taken completely out of context," Conway finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Crockett asked calmly. "Because I have the full 3-hour recording here. Would you like me to play the extended version where you specifically discuss closing polling places in black neighborhoods in Philadelphia, Detroit, and Atlanta?" Conway swallowed hard. "This is potentially illegal recording of a private meeting." "Actually," Crockett interjected, "this recording was legally made by an attendee in a one-party consent state, and it was provided to my office during our investigation into voting rights violations." She pulled out another document. "And we have the meeting agenda here, which explicitly lists demographic voting pattern management as the 3rd item of discussion." The camera zoomed in on the agenda, confirming Crockett's claim. Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. "But that's not all. I also have here an email chain from July 15th where you personally advised officials in Georgia about which drop boxes to remove, with the explicit instruction to target, and I quote, areas with demographic profiles unfavorable to our candidates." The moderator, visibly stunned, turned to Conway. "Would you like to respond to these allegations?" Conway attempted to regain her footing. This is a partisan attack using selectively edited materials." "Everything I've presented has been authenticated by independent experts," Crockett cut in. "And I haven't even gotten to the most damning evidence." She pulled out a final document. "This is a memo you wrote last year titled Messaging on Voting Restrictions. In it, you explicitly state that claims of voter fraud should be emphasized regardless of evidence because, and I quote directly, the actual goal isn't stopping fraud, but rather limiting turnout in demographic groups that don't support our candidates." The moderator looked shocked. "Ms. Conway, is this authentic?" Conway's professional facade finally cracked. "You don't understand the pressures of working in politics at that level. Sometimes strategic discussions use language that admits to intentionally suppressing votes, Crockett finished for her. That's not strategy, Miss Conway. That's confessing to undermining American democracy. Conway tried one last deflection. Everyone in politics knows these discussions happen on both sides. Do we have evidence of that? Crockett asked, her voice now sharp. Because I've just shown evidence that you personally participated in a coordinated effort to prevent American citizens from voting based on their race and presumed political affiliation. Not theoretical discussions, actual implementation plans with your name on them. The moderator, struggling to maintain his journalistic composure, turned to Conway. This is extremely serious. Would you like to address these documents directly? Conway's hands trembled slightly as she reached again for her water. After taking a sip, she attempted to recover. I've been in politics for decades. Discussions about voter turnout and demographic strategies are standard practice. Standard practice? Crockett repeated, her voice rising for the first time. Let me be absolutely clear about what these documents show. They don't show standard campaign strategy about turnout. They show explicit plans to make it harder for Black and Latino Americans to vote, with full knowledge that these actions were targeted based on race. That's not politics, that's illegal voter suppression. Conway's media training finally failed her completely. You have no idea the pressures we were under after the election. We were trying to protect what? Crockett demanded. Not democracy, not voting rights. You were protecting power at the expense of Americans' constitutional rights. The camera caught Conway's expression. A mixture of anger, shock, and the dawning realization that she had just implicitly admitted to the allegations on national television. Crockett, seizing the moment, looked directly into the camera. For months, Ms. Conway has called me a liar for claiming we had evidence of intentional voter suppression. Today, I've not only shown that evidence, but gotten her to acknowledge it was real. The American people deserve to know when their right to vote is being intentionally obstructed. Conway sat in stunned silence, the political operative who had navigated countless scandals now finding herself without words as the implications of what had just happened began to sink in. The moderator, recognizing the historic nature of the moment, turned to the camera. We need to take another break. When we return, we'll continue this extraordinary discussion about voting rights in America. As the cameras cut to commercial, Conway remained frozen in her seat, staring at the documents spread across the table, the physical evidence of what would likely become the most damaging moment of her political career. The fallout was immediate and seismic. Within minutes of the segment ending, Conway Exposed was trending nationwide on social media. Clips of the most damning moments, Conway's stunned silence, her inadvertent admission, Crockett's methodical presentation of evidence fed across platforms with unprecedented speed. CNN's website crashed temporarily under the weight of viewers trying to rewatch the full segment. News alerts lit up phones across America as competing networks scrambled to report on what had just transpired. Political commentators from across the spectrum were calling it the most consequential political interview of the decade. By nightfall, the recording had been played on every major network. MSNBC ran with the headline, "Conway confronted the smoking gun on voter suppression," while Fox News initially tried a more defensive, "Conway ambushed by Democratic lawmaker," before shifting to the more neutral, "explosive voting rights debate rocks political world," as the evidence became impossible to dismiss. In Washington, the impact was immediate. 3 congressional committees announced investigations within hours. The Department of Justice issued a carefully worded statement that they were reviewing the serious allegations raised regarding potential violations of voting rights laws. Legal experts across cable news explained the potential criminal implications of intentional race-based voter suppression. Conway herself was nowhere to be seen after leaving the CNN studio. Her scheduled appearances on other networks for the following day were all abruptly canceled. Her social media accounts went silent. Sources close to Conway told reporters she was consulting with legal counsel and evaluating her options. Representative Crockett, meanwhile, appeared at a hastily arranged press conference on Capitol Hill, flanked by the Congressional Black Caucus and voting rights activists. "What we revealed today isn't about one person," Crockett said to the assembled press. This is about a systematic effort to undermine the most fundamental right in our democracy, the right to vote. The evidence we presented shows coordination at the highest levels to prevent Americans from casting ballots based on their race and presumed political leanings. She continued, her voice steady with purpose. I'm calling on the Justice Department to launch a full investigation. I'm calling on state officials implicated in these documents to resign immediately. And I'm calling on Congress to pass voting rights protection legislation that ensures this can never happen again. The press conference was carried live on every major network, an unusual occurrence that underscored the gravity of the situation. By the following morning, the first resignations had begun. 2 state election officials implicated in the emails announced they were stepping down to spend more time with family, the traditional Washington euphemism for being forced out. A senior strategist at a major conservative think tank who had been identified in the audio recordings announced an immediate leave of absence. Political analysts began assessing the broader implications. This doesn't just damage Conway's reputation, said a prominent political scientist on Morning Joe. This has the potential to reshape the entire narrative around voting laws nationwide. The evidence presented directly connects election integrity messaging with intentional suppression efforts in a way that can't be ignored. Legal experts weighed in as well. What makes this particularly significant is the explicit racial targeting documented in these materials, a former DOJ voting rights attorney explained on CNN. That crosses the line from hardball politics into potential violations of the Voting Rights Act and possibly even civil rights statutes. 3 days after the interview, Conway finally broke her silence with a carefully worded statement released through her attorney. I regret if any comments I made in private strategy sessions have been misinterpreted or taken out of context. I have always been committed to election integrity while respecting the right of all Americans to vote. I will be taking a hiatus from public appearances to focus on family matters. The statement was widely criticized as inadequate and non-responsive to the specific evidence presented. Notice she doesn't deny the authenticity of a single document or recording, pointed out a legal analyst. That's telling. By the end of the week, Conway's regular CNN contributor contract had been mutually paused, according to a network statement. Her speaking engagements were canceled one by one. Publishers who had been in discussions about a potential memoir suddenly went quiet. In state legislatures across the country, the impact was becoming visible. In Michigan, a pending bill to reduce early voting days was abruptly withdrawn. In Georgia, a court cited Crockett's evidence in issuing an emergency injunction against closing additional polling places. In Arizona, the Secretary of State announced a comprehensive review of recent election administration changes to ensure full compliance with voting rights protections. Political strategists from both parties privately acknowledged the landscape had shifted. This is a watershed moment, a Democratic strategist told Politico. For years, we've been saying these voting restrictions were intentionally targeted, and Republicans have been saying it was about election security. Now we have the receipts. Even some Republicans distanced themselves from the tactics exposed in Crockett's evidence. If these documents are authentic, this goes far beyond acceptable election strategy, a moderate Republican senator told reporters. We can advocate for election security without targeting voters by race. That's not what our party should stand for. 2 weeks after the interview, the House Judiciary Committee held its first hearing on the documents and recordings Crockett had presented. This episode introduced committee witnesses and reporting areas where Crockett had presented. Conway, through her attorney, declined to appear, citing ongoing legal considerations. 3 election officials implicated in the materials invoked their Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. Crockett, testifying under oath, provided additional context to the evidence. These weren't isolated incidents, she explained to the committee. What we uncovered was a coordinated multi-state strategy to use election integrity as cover for targeted disenfranchisement. The evidence connects operatives across at least 7 states working from the same playbook. The hearing, which lasted nearly 6 hours, was among the most watched congressional proceedings in recent history. Meanwhile, voting rights organizations reported unprecedented surges in donations and volunteer sign-ups. We've seen a 400% increase in people wanting to help with voter protection efforts, the head of a national voting rights group told MSNBC. People are outraged by what they saw and they want to do something about it. At the 1-month mark after the interview, Conway had effectively disappeared from public life. an extraordinary development for someone who had been a fixture in political media for decades. Legal experts speculated that her silence was strategic, given the multiple investigations now underway. The impact on polling was significant as well. Surveys showed a dramatic shift in public opinion about voting laws, with 64% of Americans now saying they believed some voting restrictions were intentionally designed to suppress turnout among minority communities, up from 42% before the Conway Crockett confrontation. More concretely, voter registration drives reported record numbers in the communities most affected by the exposed suppression efforts. It's as if people are saying, "You tried to stop us from voting, just watch us now," observed a community organizer in Philadelphia. As for Crockett, her national profile had risen dramatically. She had become the face of voting rights protection, appearing on magazine covers and being mentioned as a potential future party leader. Yet in interviews, she consistently redirected attention to the broader issue. "This was never about Conway or me," she said during a 60 Minutes profile. "This was about whether our democracy genuinely works for everyone." The evidence I presented that day simply confirmed what many Americans already knew in their hearts, that there have been systematic efforts to prevent some voices from being heard at the ballot box. The most lasting impact, however, was on the legislative front. 6 months after the confrontation, Congress passed the most significant voting rights legislation in decades, with bipartisan support that would have been unimaginable before. The law established national standards for early voting, prohibited the removal of drop boxes without federal approval, required transparency in polling place decisions, and reinstated key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. When President Biden signed the bill into law, Representative Jasmine Crockett stood directly behind him, a symbolic acknowledgement of her role in making the moment possible. In Conway, she eventually re-emerged a year later, but as a much diminished figure. The strategist who had once commanded the attention of the political world now published occasional op-eds in smaller outlets and appeared on second-tier podcasts. The evidence presented that day had permanently altered her standing in American politics. Reflecting on the confrontation on its one-year anniversary, a political historian at Georgetown University perhaps put it best. What made the Conway Crockett moment so extraordinary wasn't just the evidence itself, compelling though it was watching in real time as the carefully constructed narrative around election integrity collapsed under the weight of documented truth. It was one of those rare instances where we could actually see the political landscape shifting before our eyes. The lessons were clear. In an era of carefully managed political messaging, authentic evidence still had the power to break through. A prepared public servant with receipts could still hold the powerful to account. And most importantly, Americans still care deeply about the integrity of their democracy, not as a talking point, but as a lived reality for every citizen, regardless of race, location, or political affiliation. If you found this breakdown of one of the most consequential political confrontations in recent history valuable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you in-depth analysis of the moments that truly matter in American politics, beyond the sound bites and spin. Hit the notification bell to never miss our latest videos on the stories shaping our democracy.